My mother has always had a gift for timing. Not the good kind. The kind where she waits until you're in a room full of people, until there's nowhere to go and no way to defend yourself. And then she says the thing that cuts the deepest. She's been doing it my whole life. I just kept telling myself it wasn't intentional. I stopped telling myself that on a Saturday afternoon in March, at a birthday party I had spent 4 months planning for her. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Zoe. I'm 31 years old. I work in corporate event coordination, which, yes, means I plan parties for a living. I'm good at it. I've organized galas for 500 people, product launches in Manhattan, retirement celebrations that made grown men cry. I know how to read a room, manage a vendor, talk down a florist who's having a breakdown over centerpieces. I do this professionally. I do this well, and for 4 months I did it for free. For my family. Because my mother was turning 60, and because nobody else was going to do it. And because, if I'm being honest, I thought maybe this time it would be different. I've been thinking that since I was 12 years old. My younger sister has always been the one my parents held up like a trophy. 2 years younger than me, and growing up, everything she did was remarkable. When I got a B+ on a test, it was, you could have tried harder. When she got the same grade, it was, she works so hard, she deserves every good thing. I went to a state school on partial scholarship and worked 20 hours a week to cover the rest. She went to a private university and my parents paid every cent. I never said anything about it because what was the point? The math was never going to change in my favor. By the time I was 25, I had moved out, built a career, and quietly accepted that my role in our family was the one who holds things together without being thanked for it. I paid for my grandmother's medical transport when my parents said they were short that month. I covered 2 months of my sister's rent when she between jobs after college, which lasted almost a year. I flew home 3 times to help when my dad had his knee surgery because my mother said she couldn't manage alone, and my sister was too busy. I wasn't resentful. Or I told myself I wasn't. I thought that was just what you did for family. You show up, you carry the weight, you don't keep score. Then my mother turned 60 and the whole thing unraveled, and I finally understood that I had been keeping score all along. I just hadn't admitted it to myself. It started in November. My mother mentioned, in passing, on a phone call about something else entirely, that she'd always dreamed of a real party for her 60th. Not a dinner at home, not a casual gathering, a real celebration. A venue, a band, flowers, the kind of evening that felt like something. My sister was on the same call, three-way like we sometimes did on Sunday evenings, and my sister said immediately Zoe could plan it. That's literally her job. Not, we could plan it together. Not, should we look into venues? Just, Zoe could do it. And my mother said, oh, wouldn't that be wonderful? I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for approximately 48 hours and then started making calls, because that's who I am and I hate that about myself sometimes. I reached out to a venue in downtown Charleston where my parents live. A restored event space in a historic building, exposed brick, chandeliers, the kind of place that photographs beautifully and makes people feel like the evening meant something. I got a Saturday in late March, 200 guests, which is what my mother said she wanted when I called to confirm I was doing this. 200 guests. I billed the whole event around that number. Catering for 200. A live jazz quartet I found through a colleague, genuinely talented, the kind of musicians who make cocktail hour feel like a film. A custom cake from a bakery in West Ashley that my mother had mentioned once, years ago, saying it was the best she'd ever had. I tracked down that bakery. They were still open. I booked them. I handled the florals myself, which took 3 phone calls and a trip to a wholesaler on a Tuesday morning I had to take off work to make. Ivory and sage green, my mother's favorite colors. I knew this because I pay attention. I sent formal invitations, actual paper ones, because my mother thinks digital invitations are lazy, to everyone on the guest list she gave me. I coordinated RSVPs, I built a seating chart. I arranged a shuttle service from the hotel where out-of-town guests were staying, because the parking near the venue was limited, and I didn't want anyone to have a bad experience getting there. My sister's contribution, over 4 months, was to send a group text in January saying she'd handle the photo slideshow. I built the slideshow. She sent me 12 photos and said she was swamped. I didn't say anything about that either. The week before the party, I drove to Charleston to do a final walkthrough of the venue. I met with the catering manager, confirmed the timeline, checked the sound system for the quartet. Everything was in order. I drove back home feeling something close to proud, which I should have recognized as a warning sign. My mother called me that Thursday evening. She wanted to know if I'd confirmed the good champagne she'd mentioned once, months ago, wanting a specific brand for the toast, and I had confirmed it. And I told her yes, it was confirmed. She said good. She said she was excited. She said, this is going to be really special. I told her I hope so, I meant it. The party was on a Saturday. I arrived at the venue at 2 in the afternoon for setup, 3 hours before guests were scheduled to arrive. The caterers were already there. The florist arrived at 2:30. The quartet did a sound check at 3:15. By 4:30, the space looked exactly the way I had pictured it for 4 months. My mother arrived at 5 with my father, my sister, and my sister's boyfriend, who I had met twice before. My mother walked into the room and her hand went to her mouth and she looked around and said, "Oh my goodness." That moment, that specific moment, was worth every phone call. Guests started arriving at 5:30, 200 people, which turned into closer to 180, because that's always how RSVPs work. But it didn't matter. The room felt full. The music was perfect. The champagne was cold. I spent the first hour moving quietly in the background, making sure everything flowed, the way I do at every event. Old habit. Around 7, the caterer started the dinner service. I found a moment to sit down at the end of the family table, and I let myself exhale. I looked at my mother across the table, laughing with one of her oldest friends, and I thought, okay, this was worth it. That was the last good moment of the evening. My father stood up around 7:45 to make the first toast. He talked about my mother for a few minutes, the usual things. How long they'd been married, what she meant to him. Sweet. Fine. Then he said he wanted to thank everyone who had helped make the evening possible. He looked at my sister. He said her name. He talked about how hard she had worked, how she had pulled this whole thing together, how he didn't know what they would have done without her. He said she was their rock. He said she was their rock. He said she was the daughter who always showed up. I sat very still. My sister smiled. She said, "Oh, stop, it was nothing. Nothing." I watched my mother nod along. I watched her reach across the table and squeeze my sister's hand. I watched the table applaud, and then I watched my mother look in my direction, not at me exactly, just in my direction, and turn back to her friends without saying anything. Not my name, not a mention, not a thank you, not even a look. I picked up my water glass and set it down. I straightened my fork. I told myself, not here, not tonight. You don't do this tonight. But the evening wasn't done. Around 8:30, after dinner, guests started mingling again. I was near the bar, talking to one of my mother's cousins, when I heard it. My mother was a few feet away, talking to a group of her friends, the women she's known since her 30s. The ones who knew me when I was a child and ask every year whether I'm seeing anyone. My mother was talking about the party. She said, "My younger daughter put her heart into this. She's not in events professionally or anything, but she cared so much. You can feel that, when someone does something out of pure love and not because it's just what they do for work." One of her friends said, "It's beautiful. She clearly adores you." My mother said, "She does. She really does. Zoe is very competent. She's good at the logistics. But this," she gestured at the room, "this came from the heart." I excused myself from the conversation I was in. I walked to the restroom. I stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists for about 60 seconds. I looked at myself in the mirror. Competent. Good at logistics. 4 months. 200 invitations. A custom cake from a bakery she mentioned once in passing. Ivory and sage florals in her favorite colors. A jazz quartet that had made her cry during the first song of dinner service. A seating chart that had taken me 3 hours because I knew which of her friends didn't get along and couldn't be at the same table. Good at logistics. I thought about my sister's 12 photos. I thought about the slideshow I had built. I thought about the shuttle service and the wholesaler and the Tuesday morning I took off work. And then I thought about something my best friend had said to me back in December. When I first told her I was planning this party, she had listened to the whole thing and then said, very quietly, "You know they're not going to give you credit for this, right? You know how this ends." I had told her she was being cynical. I dried my hands. I went back out into the party. I smiled at the right people, answered the right questions, made sure the cake was cut and served without any issues. I did my job because that is what I do. I left at 10:15 before the event officially ended. I told my mother I had an early morning. She said, "Of course, thank you for coming, the way you'd thank a guest." I drove back to my hotel. I had booked a room because I knew I'd be too tired to drive the 2 hours home that night. And I sat on the edge of the bed in my dress and I called my best friend. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what happened. I told her about the toast and what my mother had said at the bar, and competent and good at logistics. I told her the whole thing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want to do?" I thought about it. I said, "I want to stop." She said, "Then stop." It sounds simple when I write it out. It wasn't simple. It was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. Because walking away from your family, even a family that has been taking from you for years, doesn't feel like freedom at first. It feels like loss. It feels like something breaking. But here's what I also knew. Sitting on that hotel bed, I had given my mother the most beautiful evening of her year. I had done it professionally, thoroughly, lovingly, and she had stood 10 feet away from me and told her friends that it came from logistics, not love. That my sister, who sent 12 photos and called it done, was the one who cared. I was done arguing with that math. The next morning, I drove home. I didn't stop to say goodbye because I had said goodnight and that was enough. On the drive, I made a decision that felt very calm, which is how I know it was the right one. I was going to stop being the person who showed up without being asked and stayed without being acknowledged. I was going to stop subsidizing a version of our family that only worked because I was the one quietly funding it. I didn't call. I didn't send a message explaining myself. I just stopped. The first few weeks were strange. My mother called twice in April, once to ask if I knew where she'd put something she'd misplaced. I did not. Once to tell me about a family dinner I was apparently expected to attend. I missed both calls and sent a short text saying I was swamped with work. She responded with a thumbs up emoji both times, which told me everything I needed to know about how alarming my absence was to her. My sister texted in May. She said Mom seemed off and asked if something had happened between us. I told her I was fine, just busy. She said okay. My father called in late May. He asked how I was doing. We talked for about 8 minutes, mostly surface stuff, and then he said, "Your mother has been asking about you." I said that was nice to hear. He paused. He said, "Are you doing all right, Zoe?" "Really?" I told him I was doing better than I had in a while, which was true. He didn't know what to do with that, so he said okay, and we talked for another 2 minutes and hung up. June came. My lease in my current apartment was up, and I had been thinking for months about a change. There was a job opportunity I'd been sitting on, a senior coordinator position with a firm in Nashville, a city I'd always liked and never quite let myself move to. I had interviewed over Zoom back in February, gotten an offer, and deferred, telling them I needed until summer to decide. I called them in June and said I was in. I packed my apartment over the course of 3 weekends. A friend from work helped me with the bigger furniture. On the last weekend, I stood in the empty living room and thought about all the times I had driven back to Charleston from this apartment to help with something, to show up for something, to hold something together. The knee surgery, the rent, the birthday party. I thought, I don't have to do that anymore. I cried a little, which surprised me because it wasn't sad crying. It was the kind of crying that happens when something you've been holding for a very long time finally gets to put itself down. I moved to Nashville on a Tuesday in early July. My new apartment is on the 3rd floor, with windows that face east, And in the mornings when the light comes in, I make coffee and sit at my kitchen table. And I don't have to be anyone's logistics department. I'm just a person in an apartment with good light, starting something new. My mother called in August. I let it go to voicemail. She said she'd heard I had moved. She wasn't sure who told her. She hoped I was settling in. She said she missed me. She said she wished I'd called. I listened to the voicemail twice. I thought about calling back. I thought about what I would say, how the conversation would go, whether anything would actually be different on the other end of it. I thought about the toast, and the bar, and competent, and good at logistics. I thought about 12 photos in a group text. I didn't call back that day. I did eventually. A few weeks later, a short call. Careful and measured. The kind of conversation you have when you're deciding how much access to give someone going forward. My mother was warm. Warmer than usual. She said she was proud of me for taking the Nashville job. She said she thought it was brave. I said thank you. She didn't mention the party. She didn't mention the toast. She didn't say the word competent or acknowledge any of it, which I didn't expect her to. What I had learned, finally, at 31 years old, was that some people don't have the capacity to say the thing you need to hear. You can love them and still stop waiting for it. I'm not angry at my mother. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect this kind of story to end with rage, with a big confrontation, with someone crying in a driveway and ultimatums and a dramatic reckoning. That's not what happened. What happened is quieter and, I think, more honest. I just stopped making myself smaller to fit into a space that was never built for me. My sister called a few months after I moved. She caught me on a Sunday evening when I was in a good mood, making dinner, listening to music. We talked for almost an hour, which is longer than we talked in years. She said at some point, I feel like I didn't really know you were doing all of that. For Mom's party. I feel like I should have helped more. I said, it's okay. She said, is it? I thought about that for a second. I said, it's going to be. And I meant it. Not in the way I used to mean things, hoping I was right, telling myself a story so I could keep going. I meant it because I was standing in my own kitchen in a city I had chosen for myself, making dinner on a Sunday evening with good music on, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't doing it for anyone but me. That's the thing nobody tells you about finally stopping. You expect it to feel like giving up. You expect to feel the absence like a wound. What it actually feels like is coming home. I've thought a lot about what my mother said that night. Not the words directed at me, she barely directed anything at me, but the ones she said to her friends, the ones she didn't think I was close enough to hear. Zoe is very competent. Good at the logistics. That was it. That was the full accounting of 4 months of my life. Here's what I'd come to understand about that moment. It wasn't an accident. People don't accidentally reveal what they believe. They reveal it when they're comfortable, when they're surrounded by people who agree with them, when the person they're talking about is just far enough away. My mother wasn't being careless, she was being honest. And sometimes honesty, the real kind, not the kind people perform for your benefit, is the most useful thing someone can give you, even when it costs them nothing and costs you everything. I spent years operating on a belief that if I showed up consistently enough, gave generously enough, held things together reliably enough, eventually the accounting would shift. Eventually I would be seen. What I didn't understand then, and what I understand clearly now, is that how people see you is rarely about what you do. It's about the story they decided to tell about you a long time ago. My mother had decided my sister was the one who loved her and I was the one who performed. No amount of custom cake or ivory florals or jazz quartets was going to rewrite that story. I was trying to win an argument that wasn't happening in reality. It was happening in her head, and the verdict had already been delivered before I made a single phone call to a single vendor. That's the part that took me the longest to sit with, not the anger. The anger was easy and it passed quickly. The harder thing was accepting that I had given real effort, real time, real pieces of myself to a situation that was never going to give me what I was looking for. That's not a tragedy. That's information, and what you do with information is what actually defines you. What I did with it was move to Nashville. I think about Zoe, about myself at 31, standing in a hotel bathroom, running cold water over her wrists, looking in a mirror. And I want to tell her, This is the moment. Not the toast. Not your mother's words at the bar. This quiet moment, alone, where you finally hear the truth without anyone's voice softening it. This is where things actually change. The choices I made after that bathroom weren't dramatic. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't send the long message. I just started doing less, and then nothing, and I kept waiting for the guilt to arrive, and it didn't. Not the way I expected. What arrived instead was something that felt embarrassingly simple: space. Space to figure out who I was when I wasn't managing someone else's comfort. Space to take a job I wanted in a city I chose. Space to sit at a kitchen table with good morning light and not owe anyone an explanation. My sister told me she hadn't realized how much I'd been carrying. I believe her. That's the thing about being the one who holds things together quietly. Nobody notices the weight because you never put it down where they can see it. That's not their failure entirely. Some of it is yours for believing that carrying it silently was the same as being strong. Real strength, I've learned, looks a lot more like knowing when to stop.